Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today we're going to be talking again about Volume 1 of the Spheres Trilogy by Peter Sloterdijk, Volume 1 being called Bubbles, and we're going to move on to Chapter 2, which is called Between Faces on the Appearance of the Interfacial Intimate Sphere. And I wanted to kind of change the formula for what I'm doing here a little bit. I think maybe the previous episodes have been a little dull or something like that. So I'm going to try to kind of be more, to offer more of just like a synopsis without really quoting much from the book itself. And to try to kind of move through it quickly and explain what I think is interesting or whatever. I think that might be a better idea. You let me know if you think this has worked out better. Hopefully it's more interesting, kind of flows better, etc. than what I've been doing previously. But so this is a chapter on interfaciality, and this is right after a chapter on intercardiality, right? Because remember, spheres, we're talking about spheres volume 1 bubbles, it's microspheres. So he says that and a microsphere at its most basic is a kind of dyadic unity, right? So he says when we think about dyadic unity, when we think about the two being one, especially in Western culture, maybe particularly so, we think about romance, we think about love, we think about hearts, the heart as a kind of metaphor that's been important in Western Christian culture for a long time. And so he begins with this kind of idea of romance and the intercardiality, right? That's what we did in chapter 1. And the kind of principal metaphor that he was talking about in chapter 1 comes from a book by Ficino, Marsilius Ficino, and he is a Renaissance philosopher, and he has this kind of meditation on this romance between Lysias and Phaedrus, in which the heart, it's not the only image from that chapter, but in which, the ray, the kind of Platonic ray that enables sight, that proceeds from the eyes, that the heart kind of travels along that and implants itself in the heart of the lover. That's why there's this kind of hypnotic, magical dimension of love with Lysias and Phaedrus. And, then we also had the eating the heart of the lover sort of thing. So this sort of cardiophagy. But anyway, so that's the region of intercardiality, where he wants to say, again, with all these kind of sketches, he doesn't make sort of linear arguments. These are all sort of sketches of poetry and paintings and things like that are supposed to disclose something of the truth about the apriority of these dyadic biomes. So that, in some sense, we're made by love, by this connection that we have, this romantic connection that has this transformative power, that we're bound to each other, that we're meant for each other, etc. And then we move into this one, in which he says that the intercardial region has to always be founded on already, and specifically with this idea of Lysias and Phaedrus and the ray, that it's founded upon the previously open region of interfaciality. You have to face each other in order for eyes to lock, for rays to transfer cardial materials, to transfer the blood into the other or whatever. Right? So you already have to be gazing at each other, looking at each other. And so interfaciality as a region, he wants to disclose to us in its kind of radical a priority, saying that the interfacial spaces, two faces looking at each other, comes before the individual face, right? That it is in some way prior to, more important than, sort of ontologically more complete or something we might say. So that's what he's trying to do with this chapter on interfaciality. And the face obviously is important in philosophy and phenomenology and things like that. So a lot of that kind of plays into this too. But so he begins, with a kind of philosophical meditation on the face, political philosophical meditation on the face, phenomenological meditation on the face. And again, he moves from the intercardial space into the interfacial by saying, in order for that cardio magic to occur, the mystical exchange of hearts, you have to have the one-to-one, the interfacial dimension already opened up. There already has to be a space of mutual encounter and interaction, mutual perception, right? And that this dyadic unity is constituted by and composed of two faces looking at each other. That's the interfacial region, the interfacial space. And he says, through the face we open ourselves to others. We become available to them. They see us emotionally. We understand something beyond words. We're looking sort of into the mental, emotional life, the interior of the other. We're seeing that they're conscious, right? And we're exposing the fact that we are conscious. We see something vital in them, etc. And then you can think about Levinas, for whom the face is very important, and how the face kind of puts a plea to the other to help, to love me, to be sympathetic to me, to care for me, right? Care as a kind of experience that we have, an emotion that we have, is opened up in the visage of the face. So he's talking about two faces. They come together, they're locked, they look into each other, and so they create an emotional world, and a world of emotional residence, a world of bipolar intimacy. I was sort of thinking about this when I was reading it initially, in terms of what's this important gene in linguistics, I think, called the FOXP2 gene, which is like the mirror gene. And yeah, like when you're looking at other people, somebody yawns, it's difficult for you not to yawn. Like you automatically yawn too, or see someone with a genuine smile or something. And there's a kind of contagiousness to that, a kind of contagion. It's hard not to smile back, to smile together, to laugh together, to feel sad together, right? And so in the opening up of faces to each other, there's this kind of mimetic dimension. And also we're subjectivated. We observe and we know that we're being observed. In observing, we're observed. In looking, we're being looked at. So our subjectivities are intertwined. They constitute each other. They're mirroring each other. They're coming to understand themselves, understand each other in this mutual recognition. I recognize you. I recognize myself in you. I see the way that my actions, my speech has an effect on you. I see the emotional effect of it, etc. So in some sense, we're being subjectivated through the interlocking of faces, through the opening up of this interfacial region as a distinctly human sphere. And being perceived by another, we also become real. I know that I exist. I know that I'm real because I'm observed, right? That's like the crisis of the invisible man. I don't know if I'm real if you can't see me. Like it's a situation of, like in some ghost movies or something like that, right? You doubt your own reality if you're not observed by the other. So it's through observation by the other, through the face-to-face encounter, that we're really sort of radically reminded of the fact that we're real. We realize our reality. And at the same time, the reality of others. So then he moves from here into a discussion of artwork, mostly. That's what most of the chapter is. And the kind of artistic thematization in the West of the face, portrait arts, etc. But he begins sort of this section by talking also about Plato and the beauty, and the idea that the beautiful face reminds us of the transcendent form of beauty that we experience before we're born. And that the person is sort of just the occasion of this encounter with the transcendent, this encounter with the divine. The most beautiful faces are sort of the most transparent, in which the form of beauty is most legible in the face of the other. It's able to shine through in the most unoccluded way. That's when it's most beautiful. When it functions as a kind of medium for the perception and experience of the transcendent. And this perception, Plato says, is soul-shaking. We're moved, shocked, awed at the sight of the beautiful face. It casts a spell on us, right? Kind of like the Lysias and Phaedrus phenomenon. And he said, so Plato makes this radical discovery that faces do something incredible to us. They make available questions about truth, beauty, mutual entanglement. And then he says Ficino and his work constitute then the first attempt in modern philosophy to really describe interfacial space in his account, as we were describing, of the fascinogenic eye contact which occurs between Phaedrus and Lysias. And then he goes on to say that even before that, the face had been thematized in works of art, right? And he talks about Giotto and his motif of the biblical face-to-face. In particular, he's going to talk about Saint Anne and Joachim and the Kiss of Judas as two paintings. And he's saying that in these, Giotto is really making a pictorial effort at something like a metaphysics of facial encounters. And so he starts with Anne and Joachim, and I figured I'd show you guys the picture. I've been doing a bad job about this. So their faces form a shared circle of happiness, he says. Okay, it's going to be noticed that there are other people. There are other people there looking at them, right? Their eyes are locked. I don't know how good this picture is. We're looking at the painting, etc. And then there's a bigger one that I'll talk about in a second. And so their faces form a shared circle of happiness in the painting as they float in a bipolar sphere of intimate mutual recognition. They've shared hopes and plans. They acknowledge each other. They convey through their faces, through their face-to-face, respective knowledge of each other's merits, their combined fates. And, there are people also looking at them, like I said, looking at the painting. The picture is full of eyes, he says, that are present and draw the event and thus into the image-immanent public domain. And then he says, this is more obvious with the close-up, so I'll show you this other. So this is a close-up of the actual kiss between the two of them. He points out that their faces combine to form a third face. So a kind of third subjectivity emerges from out of the intersubjectivity of these two individuals, right? You see, if you focus kind of in the middle, a third face is formed, right? So it's like another subject. The combination is productive of a different subjectivity, right? And he says that so they form this third face, and the face is Christ. It's not Mary, right? So we move through the child to the grandchild even. Their admixture produces this new subject, Christ, makes the invisible visible, testifying to the birth, to the wonderful, to the miraculous, to the birth of Christ from out of this interfacial sphere. And then he moves on to this other sphere as a contrast, the sphere of the kiss of Judas. So this is the disciples, right? And Judas and Christ are right there. They're engaged in this kiss. The kiss is obviously the scene of betrayal, right? And this marks Jesus as the person for the guards to get, right? And he says, contrarily, this painting attests not to a sort of combination, like intersubjective combination, where you form a third subjectivity, where you're open to each other and resonating with each other. This one shows a radical point of difference, anthropological difference. There's spheric tension. There's a rupture that takes place between Judas and Christ. The divine and the mortal as a difference, the noble and the vulgar as a difference. In Christ's face, he said, suggests a kind of open sphere formative power that would even be willing to reintegrate the traitor back into this space if Judas were capable of re-entering it. But his eyes suggest instead a kind of greedy isolationism, such that even when physically so close to Jesus, he can't become part of a shared space with him. There's a close-up of this too. See? You notice there's almost like a scowl, anger, hostility, something vulgar and weak, etc. about Judas's face. Whereas in the face of Jesus, there's just sort of this openness. There's no resentment or anger or hostility. There's just a readiness to reintegrate, to form a sphere together, right? To form this interfacial sphere. But Judas can't enter back into it. He's an agent of egotism, which has invaded the shared space of this ecstatic community, all the disciples together. And so even face to face with the teacher of freedom, the epitome of Jesus as the epitome of inspiring reciprocity and participatory animation, Judas displays even here a kind of degraded selfishness that knows things only in the context of greedy possession and people only as parts of manipulative transactions. So the spherological bifold biune love sphere, sort of 12-fold with all the disciples with Christ, right, is torn asunder here at this point, right? It's ruptured. It's torn apart by debased self-interest, by individualism, by isolation, by egotism. It ruptures this ecstatic community of co-belonging, the spheric unity of this group. Then he goes on to discuss some of the sort of artistic successors of this form after a while, but I think the idea here is clear enough. He also describes Eastern Orthodox and how iconography in Eastern Orthodox has been sort of more faithful to this theme, because I guess they're more Platonic or something like that, and that truth in Eastern Orthodox can only ever be, he says, the homeward journey from the image to the archetype, but that in the West, we've had a shift away from this bifacial theme to that of the individual. And portraiture becomes very important. And he says, not just as an artistic co-founding of modern individualism, but as a kind of move toward the precise reading of private physiognomies, temperaments, moods, etc. And so people appear as singular. They start to. The individual life and the face becomes a kind of private novella that we can read. And he wants to stress that this kind of stuff, this kind of meditation on these artworks, is not only of interest to people who are like art historians, but we can observe in the transformation of this art form, of these art forms, a kind of movement in consciousness, a kind of cultural evolution in the birth of the face, the individual face, from out of this region of bifaciality, right? From out of the interfacial sphere, the elevation of the individual as a profane being who becomes in himself portrait worthy. And he says that's a late development artistically. And it's important that that's a late development artistically. Interfaciality precedes faciality. Then he kind of moves into a discussion of anthropology and the evolution of the face as a genetic historical process. He has this new term for the opening up of the face that he calls protraction. It's kind of the clearing of being in the face, the opening up of the face. And he says that this is more important even than cerebralization or the development of the thumb, right? And it enables us to become open to the world and to our fellow human beings. And he talks about sexual selection of the face, beautiful faces, the aesthetic dimension of this selectiveness as opposed to a kind of natural selection or fitness to your environment or something like that. He talks a little bit about Deleuze and Guattari, who I have not read, but apparently they have some important discussion of the face in Anti-Oedipus or something like that. And they want to say that the face is not universal or something. Again, I'm not familiar, but he thinks they're wrong, and that there's kind of two phases, and you can tell that they're wrong. He says by just comparing the faces of children to young chimps' faces, you get a sense that of the kind of faciogenetic drama, which is the opening up of the face in human history, right? And of course, as you age, there's in terms of it's like the embryo or whatever, you become sort of more like a human being or whatever as you age. You're more like some kind of animal, like a chimp or something like that, as you're an infant. What is it? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny or something like that. Phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. I don't remember what it is. But anyway, And there's first this opening up of the face, protraction, and then he says a kind of characterological inscribing upon the face that happens afterward. And he talks about sort of this human hothouse, the effect of temperature, of affectivity of the face, this, like I said, and there's kind of emotional resonance, and this emotional resonance produces an effect on human temperatures, cooling and heating in terms of affect, etc. And he says that he says to get an idea for the affectivity here, we can just look at mothers delighting in the beautiful faces of babies, which is like a universal phenomenon. And he says that the weird thing is the occasional absence of this in individuals who are excluded from these tender microclimates, the microclimate of the microsphere, the interfacial microsphere, specifically of the mother and child, and the way they look at each other and delight in each other's faces, the joy there. If you have kids or are around kids a lot, children with young mothers or whatever, you have some sense of what he's talking about here. And he's like, the behaviors, the participation, social patterns, how we respond to and feel about the face of the infant, there's a kind of universality to this. It's kind of like a conditioned behavior that's a priori constituted, that we're participating in a bipolar or multipolar fashion later when we actually have kids. But it's like the formula is already there, right? The predisposition to certain kind of affects, which is rooted in this sphere of interfaciality, faces that emerge and have emerged and evolved over time, in this kind of interfacial incubator of the mother-child field, he says. This part is sort of complicated. I hope that I'm sounding somewhat clear. But he's saying that, the evolution of the face has a lot to do with this mother-child relationship, right? And that mothers are kind of, the kind of fundamental open face, and that, this relationship is kind of fascioplastic, right? The pampering operation that takes place between the mother and the child, etc. So he thinks Darwin's theorem has to be modified into a law of the most attractive. He starts talking about, there must have been high evolutionary prizes attached over long periods to the production of facial profiles that were more delicate, more open, more delightful, and capable of joy. And you can discover this by looking at the anthropological record and looking at the faces of our primate cousins, ape cousins. And he's like, that's the opposite of environmental adaptation, showing the early tendency of evolution toward free flower formation and the erotic aesthetic hothouse of humanization. We're becoming humanized in the opening up of the face, which has to do with faces mirroring each other in openness, expressing joy, the selection for joyful faces to delight in, etc. You can kind of see this like with animals, like if you're thinking about a chihuahua versus a wolf or something like that, there's a kind of similar pressure being exerted by mostly women on dogs, I would say. So he continues with this evolutionary and historical account for a while, but the point is that the face emerges relatively late in the evolution of human beings. It's represented in artistic works relatively late. It's conceptualized relatively late. It comes to function in the identification of individual members of the species relatively late. There's a kind of synonymy of faces early on, prior to this period of protraction, the opening up of the face. And so he analogizes that. He's like, just as the genitals are the organic creations of an intergenital pleasure principle, that is to say, the individual set of genitals, or male and female or whatever, they only can emerge as individual type of genitals, as individual sets of genitals, predicated upon a kind of a priority of the belonging together of genitals, right? He's saying that's how faces operate. They open up to each other and mirror each other, etc. They develop through this interfacial interaction, right? There's a kind of evolutionary spheropoietic development of the interfacial sphere, and that evolution goes alongside the evolution of human beings. Then he sort of moves on to the East, and he talks about how important depictions of the Buddha have been in the East. The face of the Buddha, eyes closed in meditation, as an icon of detachedness, kind of animated calm on his face, a face of shared pain and shared joy, volitional, non-volition, etc. Exudes a concern for fellow men. So this has been a super important face, a representation of a face in the East that's similar to the face of Christ. But he says, unlike the face of Christ, which aims either at final suffering or the representation of transcendence, the face of the Buddha shows the pure potential of an absolutely immanent touchability by whatever comes before it, floating in a state of readiness to resonate. And so he says it's the realization of the gospel, announcing nothing but what is already there. A kind of euphoric emptiness, an expressive manifestation of euphoric emptiness, contemplation. And he says it's the opposite of the character heads of Western Caesars, for example, which are marked by violence, modeled by violence, marked by determination. He says that other faces also have had this power. He talks about a coin minted with the future Caesar Augustus's face on it, facing Julius Caesar in interfacial unity, right? And that's kind of propaganda that's saying, they resonate together. There's a filial kind of relationship between them. They belong together. There's a oneness with the two of them, and so Augustus should be Caesar. He remarks that it's weird that the female face has been kind of left out of this process in pictorial culture for a long time, until Marian iconography. That's the big example of pictorial culture thematizing the female face in the West. And he says this is paradoxical because the mother's face is the focus of humanization, the focus of interfacialization in evolutionary history, in human evolution. And so the mother's face is a kind of invitation to humanization, but it's lacked thematization in art. And that art, when it's tended to focus on women, has focused on their sexual power, especially iconographically. And he says, but it's kind of like this primordial relationship with the mother in humanization, right, is sort of repressed in image culture. The relationship of the child with the mother gets repressed. And, as a kind of psychocultural repression in image culture. Then he launches into a discussion of the face as a locus of terror and archaic representations of the face and the interfacial region, like the face as foreign, as other, face as masks and shields, faces that are disfigured. He says the mask is a facial shield raised in the war of sights. And he talks a little bit about modern deformations of the face and the interfacial region, this stuff is particularly interesting to me, about plastic surgeons, molding, deforming, reforming faces, the permanent grin of celebrities who think, who are constantly engaged with the paparazzi or marketing themselves. We might say today the person who's constantly taking selfies, the deformations of the face with Instagram filters and Photoshop. He thinks that it's interesting that the idea of interface, or the word interface today, has become highly important, but precisely as a region of confrontation between faces and non-faces, or between two non-faces. Human faces exist in reality, not for themselves, but for the other. And he says the Greek word for face is prosopon, right? And that refers to the sight that one presents of themselves to others, specifically, being available to the gaze of others. This is also why the word for slave in Greek was aproposon, without a face, because they don't appear in the public realm. They're restricted to the private, right? There's a privation of publicity They don't occur. They don't have a face. They don't present themselves to others. They're not seen by others. And then he starts to talk about mirrors, which is interesting. He actually does refer to Lacan here, and Lacan's idea of the mirror stage. And he has a kind of critique of Lacan. He says that mirrors are a recent invention. For most of human history, people never really saw their own faces at all. Even insofar as sort of ancient versions of mirrors and stuff like that invented, they were existed to some degree. They were like, had by nobility or something like that. They were extremely rare or non-existent in most places and most time, right? So most humans throughout history have not seen their own faces really, or barely ever, if ever, saw their own faces. We tend to think that like looking in a mirror, seeing yourself, thinking about and managing the way you look, your face as an object is like a natural, universal thing. And he reminds us that it's not. So something like the idea of narcissism as a form of autoerotic desire, right? Loving your own image, your own face, he thinks is an absurdity. He thinks we should understand narcissism in a very different kind of way. I don't think that Lacan's theory of the mirror stage really requires any kind of trans-historical relationship of the self with his self-image via a mirror or something like that. But we can leave that aside for now. It's more about the formation of an idea or an image of yourself, a mental concept of who you are, and the imaginary, I guess, that means something like what you look like, but I don't think that requires staring at your own face in a mirror or whatever, even though that's the metaphor. Anyway, but the face was basically always other, always an object, not a subject, right? An object for others. It's a way that you become an object for others, and others are an object for you. You learned about your own face by looking at how faces reacted to your face. And so he has some interesting discussion here of individualism, kind of nascent individualism, and how you could only observe yourself by adopting the perspective of the other and thinking about yourself, seeing yourself through their eyes that are not yours. And he says that eventually we become isolated subjects only under the dominion of the mirror, reflecting on ourselves, having direct access to ourselves as both subject and object with the reflexivity of the mirror, as though human beings could play both parts in the bipolar interfaciality game. There's this delusion of being a private individual face that's alone with himself, that's subject and object. Whereas really, again, the interfacial is prior to the facial. But he says ultimately we wind up thinking that our relationship with ourselves is the primary part and the relationship with others is accidental and secondary. That's a mistake. It's a delusion. We have a mirror in every home, in every room sometimes. Today we all basically inhabit this kind of fiction of self-completion with the illusion that we live in an intimate sphere that only has one inhabitant. And this was never the case. We came out of the interfacial. We came out of the intercardial, etc. So I think I'm going to start going one chapter at a time, like I did right here. I think that'll be better with time commitments and things like that. So, but let me know if this worked a little bit better, this kind of format. And please like, share, comment, subscribe, etc. Remember, don't think, or remember to think. Don't simply react, but think culture.